The video was sent to me on a return unseen flash drive inside a plain yellow envelope postmarked Ohio. No note, no explanation. Just the title typed in all caps on the file, Walking into Funeral 1217 MP4. I thought it was source material for my new documentary about lapses of identity. But when I opened the video, I realized something that stopped my breath. The woman walking through the chapel door was the same one lying inside the casket. The recording was professional quality, with diffuse lighting and perfect focus. The woman walked between the benches as guests turned, first in shock, then in panic. The sound was muffled, as if an invisible atmospheric pressure were pressing down on the microphone. The woman in the video looked confused, like someone waking from a nightmare and trying to figure out where she was. She stared at her own body. The same dress, the same hair, the same silver necklace with a small cross. I paused the video several times. There were no visible tricks, no sudden cuts. Everything was continuous, organic, real. The timer in the bottom corner read 10:32 a.m., and the reflection in the glass behind the coffin showed the same clock, marking the same time, twice. I captured frames, enlarged shadows, tested contrast. The duplication was perfect, pixel by pixel. No digital overlay could recreate that kind of light consistency. I sent the file to a university colleague, an expert in detecting visual manipulation. He responded 2 hours later with a short message. This isn't editing. The light field is continuous, but there's something wrong with the timing. I asked him to explain, but he never responded. The next day, his institutional email was deactivated, and the building where he worked, according to the office, was under renovation. I rewatched the recording with headphones. At 43 seconds, I heard a low-frequency hum like radio static. The image shook slightly, and for a moment the overhead lights flickered in sync with the sound. It sounded like a recording error, but the shaking also affected the shadows, which meant something physical was flickering, not just the video. I replayed the clip in slow motion. The instant the humming stopped, everyone in the room disappeared, literally. One frame showed the woman looking around, surrounded by dozens of guests. The next showed only her and the body in the coffin. No transition, no fade. The flowers remained in the same place. The cloth over the coffin moved, as if the air still held a human presence. But the faces, the bodies, the sounds, everything had been erased. I froze the video at that point. I zoomed in on every corner of the screen, looking for clues, reflections, shadows, any indication of where the people might have gone. Nothing. The only remaining movement was the barely perceptible flickering of the candles. That's when I noticed a detail I'd previously overlooked. The name on the banner over the casket wasn't the same as the file name. The video said, Walking into Funeral 1217.mp4, but the banner read, Service for Elizabeth R. Holden, December 21st. I tried to locate obituary records for that name. I found only one, a 36-year-old woman from Dayton, Ohio, who died in a car accident on December 21, 2017. Apparently, her funeral had taken place at 10:30 a.m., exactly the time of the filming. But there was one impossible detail. The video's creation date was December 16th, 5 days before her confirmed death. I spent the entire night trying to figure it out. It could have been a metadata error, a misaligned camera clock, but still something didn't add up. The geolocation coordinates embedded in the file indicated a different location, Cedar Falls, Iowa, a completely different state. 2 ceremonies, 2 locations, the same woman. I sent the file to the Federal Media Forensics Department, using my old contact from when I worked on a deepfake project. 2 weeks later, I received a phone call from a restricted number. The voice on the other end was tinny and full of interference. They only said one sentence. The file doesn't belong in this era. The call ended before I could ask what that meant. Since then, the flash drive has disappeared from my drawer. No one has admitted to touching it, and yet sometimes I see it reflected in my window, as if it was still there inside the office. When I turn on my computer, a new folder is always automatically created with the same name as the video, and inside it a single frame, me standing at the back of the chapel. Looking at the camera, my name is Dr. Aaron Keller, an associate professor of experimental psychology at Cedar Falls University in Iowa. For years, I've studied collective memory disorders, group recall lapses, false temporal records, and mass cognitive errors. I've always approached the subject empirically, searching for correlations between trauma and memory reconstruction. I never imagined I'd become the subject of the very phenomenon I studied. In the fall of 2023, my routine was predictable. Wake up at 6:30 a.m., drive Highway 27 to campus, teach classes, review reports. Everything was calm, functional, and methodical. The building where I teach, Dunmore Hall, has always had a strange vibe. Something about the sound of the air conditioning, the way the sodium vapor lamps flicker in the central hallway. Some students commented that the clock in the lobby never showed the same time 2 days in a row. I laughed at this at first. I attributed it to electrical faults, old circuits. But I began to notice that the variations didn't follow a logical pattern. Sometimes the clock would be 3 minutes slow. Other times it would be 11 minutes fast. And one morning it was 2:14 a.m. Even though it was broad daylight. I keep notes of these incidents. I've always been too methodical to ignore coincidences. On December 10th, a week before the video arrived, I found a typed sheet of paper stuck under my office door. No signature, no title. Just one sentence, "She's still alive." No context. The text was typed on an old typewriter, probably from the 1970s or 1980s. The ribbon was dry ink, and the letter E skipped. I recognized the style because the university keeps machines like that in the basement of the Historical Archives department. I went down to check. The basement smelled of mold and burnt paper. The fluorescent lights flickered, and there was a low noise, not a hum, but something like a sub-audible tone, almost felt in the pit of my stomach. The clerk in charge, an elderly man named Robert Holden, said he wasn't aware of any missing sheets. His last name caught my eye, but I only realized the coincidence later. He seemed confused when I asked about old death dates stored on microfilm. "Some tapes don't match the official records," he said, rubbing his forehead. "It seems like there are duplicate days." I returned to the office with an uneasy feeling, not of fear but of misalignment. The shadows seemed to fall at the wrong angles. The sun was too white for that hour. When I checked my digital clock, it read 11:11, but the analog clock on the wall said 9:47. I grabbed my phone to sync, and it said 10:59. Neither of them was off enough to feel faulty, but together, they created a gap I couldn't bridge. That afternoon, during the temporal perception and reality construction class, I projected a graph measuring perceived time distortions under stress. One of the students, named Evan, raised his hand and asked, "Professor, does this explain why sometimes days repeat themselves?" I laughed, thinking he was joking. But he continued seriously. "Yesterday we had this exact class. I remember every word you said." Other students nodded in agreement. One of them showed a note in his notebook with the same content, dated the previous day. This disturbed me more than I admitted. I checked the calendar on the bulletin board. The day was marked as Tuesday, December 12th. But the attendance register indicated Wednesday, the 13th. I thought someone was playing a prank, until I noticed that the camera footage from the room showed two identical files, both named Lecture 1212 MP4, same duration, same framing, same audio, but with different creation dates. I sent an internal report to the IT department, requesting an audit of the recording systems. The next day I received a standard response saying that no file with that name existed. When I tried to open the videos on my flash drive, the system displayed an error. "File not found already exists." I assumed it was a virus, data corruption, or perhaps some elaborate prank. Still, I couldn't delete it. Every time I deleted the folder, it returned with the modified name 12 of 17. Coincidentally, that was the same date as the title of the video I received later. At that point, I still didn't see the connection. I continued recording everything in my journal, noticing the patterns. The campus lights flickered more frequently, and sometimes the sound of footsteps echoed delayed, as if the sound arrived a second after the movement. Nothing supernatural, just impossible to measure. That night I came home exhausted. My wife, Lena, commented that I was becoming obsessed with made-up anomalies, but then she said something that chilled me. "You recorded the same interview twice, honey. Once last week and once yesterday, with the same outfit, the same questions. Don't you remember?" I tried to laugh, but she showed me the video on her phone. It was me with the same voice, the same watch, even the same stumble in my sentence. Only at the end I said a different date, December 21st. The next morning I woke with the sensation that something had shifted inside the apartment. The air felt colder, as if the windows were open, but they were all locked. The living room clock read 6:12, while the one on the microwave showed 7:46. I didn't pay it any attention. I simply noted the difference. When I went to the bathroom, I noticed the mirror was slightly fogged up, though there was no steam. I wrote with my finger on impulse just to test. The glass returned the words backward, but with a slight delay, as if an independent reflection were trying to keep up. Lena had left early for work. The house seemed too empty, without the usual hum of the heater. I opened my laptop and found a new email, with no identified sender. The subject line read, "Check 1217. No body text, no attachments." But the system clock read 1217 despite it being morning. The coincidence would have been commonplace if it weren't for the detail that made me freeze. The computer was showing the date, December 21st, when the physical calendar on my desk was still on the 14th. I rebooted the machine and the date returned to normal. I attributed it to a BIOS glitch, perhaps. Even so, a persistent feeling of disharmony stayed with me all day. On campus, I noticed small changes in Dunmore Hall. The bulletin board was arranged differently, the same papers but tacked in different positions. The electrical maintenance notice was now dated December 21st, but I distinctly remembered reading December 10th, the week before. I went to the registrar's office to confirm, and the clerk, Sharon, looked at me in confusion. "Professor Keller, you asked to change the date. You said the system needed to be synchronized with the security protocol." I swore I'd never done that. She showed me the authorization email, sent from my institutional address. I glanced at the email header. The sender was my own name, but with one detail. The domain had an extra hyphen. aaronkellercedarfalls.edu, with a double S at the end. I tried to reply, but the message returned with the warning, "User does not exist on this server." Sharon said the authorization had been received exactly 7 days ago, at 10:32 a.m., the same time as the video. I returned to the office and found the journal I'd been using to record the incidents. The last few pages were different. The writing was mine, the handwriting identical, but the content was different. Instead of observations about clocks and dates, there were detailed descriptions of a funeral. The name Elizabeth Holden appeared several times, followed by crossed-out words, duplicate, reversal, ongoing event. I thought a student had gone through my things, but the final lines read, "If you're reading this, it's not the same day anymore." I tried to remember when I'd written that. No memory. The last confirmed entry in my memory was the conversation with Lena about the duplicate interviews. I opened my personal email to check old messages. The most recent one said, "You shouldn't have opened the file." The sender? Robert Holden, the same historical archives employee who, according to the university, had retired in 2019. I decided to go to his house. The address was listed in the old records, a narrow street on the outskirts of Cedar Falls. When I arrived, the place looked abandoned, but the lawn was freshly mowed, and there was a newspaper dated yesterday on the porch. I rang the doorbell, no answer. The side window was ajar, and from inside came a rhythmic metallic sound, like the ticking of many clocks all at once, but out of sync. I peeked through the crack and saw dozens of hanging wall clocks, all showing different times. I called out to him. No voice answered. Then I heard a sharp click, like a switch being flipped. All the clocks stopped simultaneously. A cold draft blew through the window and extinguished the flame of the lighter I was holding. When the light returned, there was an envelope on the table with my name typed on it. I opened it. Inside, a single photo, the chapel from the video, but now empty, covered in dust and cobwebs. On the back, in shaky letters, "The recording took place here 6 years ago." I took the photo to the campus lab. The image analysis system indicated old metadata, 2017, the same date as Elizabeth's death. But the most disturbing detail was another. The photo contained a reflection in the window in the background. It was my face, identical to the one I have now, only a little older. On the way back, I stopped the car at a traffic light. I glanced at the dashboard clock, 10:32, and for a moment the radio turned on by itself. The voice coming from the speakers was mine, calmly saying, "You've been here before." Over the next few days, my perception began to fragment into tiny cracks. The sequence of events seemed logical only as I talked about them. I only had to close my eyes for the hours to shift, as if time were a poorly assembled mosaic. Each morning, the objects in my house were arranged slightly differently. The lamp on the left, then on the right. The picture frame with Lena facing the wall. The television tuned to channels broadcasting nothing but blue static. I began recording everything with a handheld camera, only to discover that the recordings showed contradictory versions of the same environments. In one, the room was spotless, as always. In the other, the walls were cracked. The carpet was missing. And the clock read December 21st, 2017. I tried to compare the two videos frame by frame. But each time I paused, the times changed. Sometimes the second video would jump ahead on its own, as if the file were trying to catch up. When I captured a still image, I noticed a reflection in the window, my own figure, but wearing the same shirt from the previous recording. Observing the scene from outside, I began investigating the name Elizabeth Holden further. I discovered that her case had been dismissed by the state police without formal investigation. Automobile accident, no foul play suspected. However, there was a curious footnote. Report of sighting after date of death unconfirmed. I called the Dayton police station and asked for access to the original reports. The dispatcher hesitated. "Those documents are no longer in the system. They've been transferred to the Civilian Anomaly File, Department of Homeland Security." I asked what that file was. He simply replied, "It's not accessible to civilians, Mr. Keller, and please don't mention that name over the phone." That night, I received another email, again with no sender, with only a link to a hidden folder on the university server. Inside were dozens of files named with numerical codes, all containing footage of different funerals. People entered the ceremonies and watched themselves in the caskets. All the videos were dated between 2017 and 2023. In some I was present, sometimes sitting in the back, other times walking among the guests. None of these events, as far as I could verify, had officially taken place. I sent encrypted copies to an external drive and tried to show them to Lena. When I plugged the device into my computer, all the files were replaced by a single text document. "You shouldn't be here." The system froze, and the office lights flickered for a few seconds. The sound of the air conditioning changed frequency, turning into a continuous vibration that seemed to come from within the walls. Lena yelled from the kitchen, saying the lights were flickering in sync with my laptop. Then everything went black. When the power came back on, she was gone. The house was intact, but there were 2 mugs of coffee on the table, one still hot, one cold. I looked around and found her cell phone on the couch. The last messages she exchanged with me were strangely duplicated, with inverted timestamps. One sent at 9:12 a.m., the other received at 9:12 a.m., but on different dates. The operator later confirmed that there was no record of any calls during that period. Desperate, I returned to the basement of Dunmore Hall to look for Mr. Holden. The place was empty, except for a stack of boxes marked with old government labels. The light flickered at irregular intervals, and a strip of yellow tape lay on the floor, marking off a circular area. In the center sat a metal chair, and on it sat an old reel-to-reel tape recorder still working. The tape spun slowly, emitting a low hiss. I pressed play. The voice that came out was mine, but older, more tired. "Experiment 12-17, Phase 3. Subject shows loss of temporal reference and duplication of episodic memory. The correction line must be interrupted before the convergence point." Then a pause. And another voice, female, distant, almost whispering, added, "She's already in the room." "Aaron, and she shouldn't have." The sound abruptly stopped, leaving only the electric hum that seemed to pulse through the walls. I checked the labels on the boxes. They all bore the same code, CF1217EH. I opened one. Inside were dozens of tapes with my name and dates back to 2017. Some contained handwritten notes with details I recognized as my own research, but describing events I hadn't yet experienced. The most recent one read, "Failure point, Elizabeth R. Holden funeral. Pending correction." On the far wall was a narrow, dust-covered window. When I wiped the glass with my sleeve, I realized the reflection didn't match the surroundings behind me. Instead of the basement, I saw the chapel, the same one from the video. In the center of it, a woman stood gazing at an open coffin, and for the first time I saw the woman's face clearly. It was Lena. From the moment I saw Lena's face through the basement window, I realized the concept of before and after no longer made sense. I ran outside trying to reach the parking lot, but the hallway seemed to stretch like a rubber band. Repeating the same 3 doors, the same maintenance sign, the same sound of the wall clock that incessantly marked 10:32. Sometimes the second hand would run backward. Other times, it would pause for long intervals and then start again from the previous point. I started filming, just to capture tangible proof, but the camera's viewfinder showed my own image walking ahead, as if I were following myself. The air vibrated with an invisible tension, an inaudible frequency that seemed to displace sound. When I finally reached the exit, I noticed the daylight was the wrong color. The sky wasn't blue, but a metallic hue, almost like the reflection of a switched-off screen. No wind, no car noise, just the low sound of static filling the space. The campus was completely empty, but the doors rattled as if they'd just been opened. I tried connecting my phone. The screen flickered, displaying the message, "No signal, weather does not exist." I drove toward town without thinking. The road stretched straight, endless, flanked by frozen fields. The signs were in English, but the letters seemed slightly distorted, as if the language were correcting itself in real time. After a few miles, I saw a green sign, Dayton 12 Mai. I accelerated. The clouds overhead moved against the wind, and the horizon trembled like a magnetic tape. When I reached the city center, the car clock still read 10:32. Not a minute had passed. I stopped in front of a small white chapel, the same building as in the photo. The place looked abandoned for years. The doors were ajar and the floor was covered in dry leaves. Inside there were rows of benches covered in sheets and an empty coffin on the altar. The air was cold, smelling of rusted metal and dead flowers. On top of the coffin, a small portable voice recorder blinked red. I pressed play. The voice that came out was Lena's, calm, almost whispering, "Aaron, if you hear this, it's too late. This isn't her funeral. It never was." I recorded everything, narrating as if I were still a rational researcher. I described the environment, the sound, the temperature, but the tape distorted the audio as I spoke, repeating parts of sentences in the wrong order. When I played it back, my voice said, "You are recording from within the archive itself." I looked around, but there were no cameras, no signs of recording. Yet the hum in the air grew more intense every time I mentioned dates. I tested December 21st, 2017. The sound grew louder. December 16th. Silence. The light began to change, oscillating between the cold tone of day and the yellow of old lamps. I felt the floor vibrate beneath my feet, and for a moment the room seemed to dissolve into 2 overlapping images. The empty chapel and, above it, the same chapel full of people, all standing still, like wax figures. In the center, Lena looking directly at me. I took a step forward and felt the air thicken, as if passing through a curtain of liquid. The noise ceased and the 2 images merged. She blinked. The people around her began to disappear one by one, as if erased by an invisible editor. When I got closer, I saw that the coffin was no longer empty. Inside it, my body, younger perhaps a few years, wearing the same suit I'd worn to my thesis defense. Lena placed her hand on the glass and said simply, "You promised you'd stop at the 3rd phase." Before I could respond, she herself began to dissolve into particles of light. The collapse was auditory before it was visual, a deep crack, followed by absolute silence. The ground tilted, and I realized everything around me was being rewritten. The benches dissolving into numbers, the walls into date codes, the sky into a grid of pixels. I tried to run, but my feet felt trapped. Time didn't flow, it folded. I felt like each breath was a repetition of the last, and each blink showed me a different fragment of my life. When I woke up, I was sitting in my office at my computer. On the monitor, the video Walking into Funeral 1217 MP4 was open, frozen on the image of the woman entering the chapel. I looked closely. She was still Lena, but the man in the coffin was now me, exactly as I saw myself at that moment. I glanced at the clock on the wall. It read 10:32. and when I turned to the window, I saw the reflection of a tape recorder spinning slowly on the table. The sound it emitted wasn't from the present. It was the sound of myself describing this moment word for word. The video stopped at the frame where Lena entered the chapel. The monitor's light flickered irregularly, casting shadows that seemed to breathe across the office walls. I sifted through the files on my hard drive, trying to understand the recording's origin. Each folder contained versions of the same video, but with dates that didn't make sense. Some marked years in the future, others with dates before my own university enrollment. One file in particular caught my eye, footage Oruro 1 prototype. The file size was too small to contain video, but the name seemed like a clue. Upon opening, I found only a text document with a single line. Sequence initiated. Subject recognizes the pattern. Below, geographic coordinates 397589 degree N, 1916 degree W. The same spot as the university, the same research building. I opened the browser and overlaid the data. Everything pointed to the old neuroimaging lab, deactivated since 2015, where we tested visual stimuli capable of inducing false memory patterns. At the time, we called the project the mirror phase. I was the lead assistant, and Lena was volunteer number 7. I returned to the video and let it play at a reduced speed. At 32 seconds, when the woman, Lena, walks past the camera, a figure appears in the right corner of the screen, a man holding a recorder identical to mine. I paused, zoomed in. The face was mine, but some details were off. The dull eyes, the rigid posture, the absence of visible breathing. A reflection without a source. The video continued, but the audio this time featured overlapping voices, clippings of my lines from old interviews, mixed with excerpts from sessions of the original experiment. I myself said, prolonged exposure creates a self-perception loop. It was at this point that I realized the research I thought I was conducting was actually part of a protocol. The anomalies I encountered, the woman at the funeral, the clock fixed at 10:32, the disappearance of the people, were not isolated events. They were stimuli programmed to test the brain's ability to recognize flaws in reality itself. The subject in this case was me. What I could never determine was whether I was still inside the test, or if the test had become the entire world. I picked up the recorder on the table and rewound to the beginning. The first words weren't mine. It was Lena's voice. "If you're hearing this, it means the mirror has responded." She spoke calmly, like someone accepting the inevitable. "So you had to watch the funeral because you still believed you were the observer. But we are all the archive." The noise grew louder as she spoke, and beneath the distortion, there was another voice, a second version of me, repeating each sentence in unison. With a half-second delay, I left the office. In the hallway, all the lights were on, though no one had worked there for weeks. The windows reflected the same space, but without me. In one of the reflections, I saw the monitor flickering, but on the screen, the video was still paused, showing me standing in the doorway, exactly as I was at that moment. The image moved before I moved. They smiled at me from the other side, versions of me, older, more tired. The glass vibrated and the light went out. When I woke up, I was lying on the lab floor. The walls were covered in cracked mirrors, and in the center was a tripod with a still-on camera. On the screen, the recording displayed the file name, Phase 3 completed, the date 10:32 a.m., 12/21/2017. In the background, Lena appeared holding a clipboard. She seemed alive. "Aaron, you finally realized," she said, looking into the lens. "The collapse didn't destroy reality. It just duplicated you within it." My body felt heavy, as if gravity had shifted. As I tried to stand, I realized there was another recorder beside me, identical to the first but covered in dust. The audio started on its own. It was my voice, but describing this exact moment in real time. Every word I said was recorded before I spoke it. The echo formed a loop, a delay of a few seconds that became unbearable. I covered my ears, but I could still hear, from inside my head, not from outside. The clock's sound resumed. 10:32, the same motionless hand. When I looked around, I noticed the walls were covered with hundreds of sticky notes, diagrams, instructions, camera sketches, and lines connecting points in time. They all led to a center marked in red ink, Subject 01, Returning Consciousness. Beside it, a newspaper clipping with the headline, researcher missing during virtual reality tests. The photo below was mine. I took the clipping and recorded it on the camera. The image wavered, as if refusing to register. The lens showed my hand, but the reflection in the glass showed someone else, an older version of me with a calm, resigned look. He lifted the recorder and whispered, "Let it play. The next sequence starts now." And then the monitor returned to the original video. A woman walked into her own funeral. But this time, I was the man opening the door for her. The lab lights pulsed at irregular intervals, casting shadows that moved autonomously, as if the room breathed in cycles different from real time. The cameras were still recording, but without sound. Each time I blinked, the framing shifted slightly, as if an unseen director were reshooting the scene from a new angle. I picked up the recorder and pressed play, but this time the voice that responded wasn't mine. It was a male narration, slow, scientific, describing my every movement with clinical precision. The name mentioned repeatedly was mine. Subject 0 confirms perception of failure. Synchronization, 98% complete. I looked around and realized the space had shifted. The laboratory corridor now extended inward, an impossible spiral, where the end was also the beginning. Identical doors multiplied, each opening onto variations of the same office. In one, the windows were closed. In another, it was raining inside the room. In another, the monitor showed a video of me watching this very moment. I touched one of the doorknobs and felt a metallic vibration that transformed into a voice. To choose is to repeat. I walked down the hallway. The notes on the walls changed as I passed. Phrases that had once described the experiment now became confessions. I am not the observer. The funeral is the reboot. Every duplicate must watch its own death to understand. Tapes spun in recorders that floated in the air, playing radio noises interspersed with slow heartbeats. For a moment I heard footsteps behind me, light in sync with my own. I turned and saw Lena again, standing at the head of the hallway. She smiled, her lips moving before I heard her voice. "Aaron, the funeral was yours." I tried to respond, but no sound came out. My throat felt sealed shut. Then I realized she wasn't really there. She was a projection of the recording, repeating a loop I'd created years before. At the end of the hallway, a door opened of its own accord. From it came a diffuse white light, similar to the glow of an old-fashioned projector. In the center of the room stood a closed coffin, identical to the one in the video. The lid moved slowly, and the sound that accompanied the creaking of the wood was the click of a camera starting to record. I approached cautiously. Each step made the floor emit the sound of a tape rewinding. When I touched the lid, I felt an electrical resistance, as if the air vibrated in denial. The coffin opened by itself. Inside was the recorder, still flashing red. The display read, "Playback active, do not interrupt." In the back of the compartment, a metallic reflection showed my own face, but it was younger still, and my eyes were open. The scene was identical to the final frame of the video. The clock on the wall read 10:32. A growing hum filled the room, mixed with whispered voices in multiple languages, overlapping until they became pure white noise. The light bulbs exploded one by one, leaving only the monitor screen lit. On it, the file renamed itself Phase 4 Synthesis. Below, a countdown timer, 0010. The recorder fell from my hand and continued to play on the floor, capturing the sound of the air distorting. Space began to bend, not violently but slowly, like a tape being wound backward. Then I realized the pattern. Every time someone watched the video, the sequence reset, and a new version of me appeared in place of the previous one. The funeral was the fusion point, reality's attempt to correct the excess consciousness. Lena hadn't died. None of us had died. We were stuck in different moments of the same event, trying to remember who started the loop. The video was the catalyst, the only record that hadn't yet been erased from within the sequence. The counter reached 0, and the sound stopped. For a few seconds, there was absolute silence. Then a new recording began on its own. In the image, I entered the chapel, filming the funeral with calm steps. The camera shook slightly, and in the background I could hear someone crying, the same breathing I heard now. As the camera approached the coffin, there was a pause. The lid lifted. The woman inside, Lena, opened her eyes and looked directly at the me watching from the other side. "Do you understand now?" she asks. And before I can answer, the video ends abruptly. But seconds later, the recording continues. I'm still talking, describing the scene, analyzing it, trying to find logic, even without the recorder in my hands. The sound repeats, a self-contained cycle without origin or end. The tape continues to record everything, even when the air becomes still and the image freezes. And then I realize the ultimate impossibility. The recording ends before I even press the record button.